Hello again, and welcome back to episode 4 of my coursework introduction. In this episode, we're going to think about the historians who argue that the Cold War was caused by the United States. In kind of technical terms, these historians are often referred to as revisionists because they are revising the original idea about the Cold War. And they first came about in the sort of mid-60s and into the 70s, at the time actually when the Vietnam War was in full flow. At that time, Western historians, and especially American historians, began to doubt that their government, the American government, were the good guys in this Cold War, and began to look back at and revise their opinion about some of the actions the American government took straight after the Second World War. And so that's where this idea comes about. Now, your job is going to be to assess the credibility of their argument. And so, again, like before, I'm just going to steer you through very quickly some of these events that you know where to look for. And your job is to make a note of these events, to get yourself a bit of a timeline together. And then if you choose to do the start of the Cold War, you'll need to go on and look at these events in some detail in order to assess whether those historians were right to say the Americans were being aggressive here and confrontational in these events, or whether that's actually been exaggerated and misinterpreted. So starting at the beginning, in fact, starting right at the beginning, back in after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, some of these historians would argue that the American and Western hostility to communism was shown straight away in the Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War was between the communists, the Reds, and everyone else, the whites. Really, the whites wanted to, well, no, actually, that's simplification. I was going to say they wanted to restore the Tsar, but actually they didn't want to do that. It's between the Reds and everyone else. And the West back everyone else. They provide some financial support and a few troops, really kind of in the rear, not actually fighting troops. So, but they definitely are seen as promoters of the white side in that conflict. Also, in the run-up to the Second World War, there's this perception from Stalin and the Soviet Union, not complete without merit, that the not the Americans, but the West are quite happy for Hitler to go and fight against the Soviets. This is crystallized really at the Munich conference in 1938, where Britain and France give away part of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia is to the southeast of Germany, and it seems like Britain and France are sort of saying, don't come west, but if you want to nibble away at the east and you want a little pathway through to the Soviet Union, yeah, go ahead. We're not that fussed about it. We're not going to stick up for countries in the east because, yeah, if that leads you closer to defeating Stalin, then great. These things certainly put a negative thought in the back of Stalin's mind, and he's probably not someone who needs the encouragement to think in a paranoid sense about the West. Actually, that's exacerbated perhaps earlier on in the Second World War, because in 1941, before they'd joined the war, before actually either the Soviet Union or America joined the war, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met on a Navy ship in the Atlantic, and they started to dream together about what life would look like after the Second World War. They drew up what's called the Atlantic Charter, and you'll need to read through that. But the Atlantic Charter basically says, after the war, the world, wouldn't it be great if the world was capitalist and democratic? Neither of which applies to the Soviet Union. So it seems to suggest that, that America and Britain, to an extent, were thinking about a world without the Soviet Union, or certainly without a communist Soviet Union, in the medium term. That is inherently hostile, these historians would argue. Stalin also is very critical of America and Britain once America does join the war, because he wants help. And the Germans are fighting deep inside the Soviet Union for really all of 1942 and quite a lot of 1943. During which time America and Britain are just sat around in Britain or training in America. Stalin is constantly saying, please come and help. Please, I need your help. My civilians and my troops are dying by the thousands, eventually by the millions. I need some support. And the Americans say, yeah, well, we're just training. We'll be ready soon. To Stalin, this looks like they are hoping that the Nazis will eventually defeat the Soviets, perhaps exhaust themselves doing so, and that the Americans and the Western capitalists can come in and defeat the Nazis and win the war, and get rid of both in one go. That is Stalin's reasoning for what he sees as the delays to D-Day. D-Day doesn't happen until June 1944. America enters the war in December 1941. So all of 1942, all of 1943, half of 1944, no American presence or British presence on mainland Europe. Stalin sees that as hostile. Also, the ending of the war in Japan with 2 atom bombs. Again, historians who see the Americans as being the protagonists in the Cold War and the aggressive, assertive, provocative force would say that the use of the atom bombs is, of course, partly to defeat Japan, but they would say it is also all about trying to intimidate the Soviet Union, trying to show the Soviet Union that we have this bomb, it's bigger than anything you've got, it's more powerful than anything you've got, back off, we're in charge here. It also, of course, means that America takes sole ownership of Japan at the end of the war, which gives them another place where they are strong and forces the Soviet Union out of that. So all that's kind of in this bit up to it. What we're doing here is trying to pitch that the Americans all along were at least angling for a Western capitalist future for the world. What happens after the war is that they begin to be more and more assertive in trying to push the Soviets back into their corner and to assert a Western capitalist future on as much of the world as possible. That starts with perhaps the long telegrams. There's some stuff that they write and say and some stuff that they do. The long telegram was written in February 1946 by George Kennan, and a diplomat in Moscow, an American diplomat in Moscow, who writes this huge telegram and sends it to Washington, essentially saying the Soviets don't recognize anything except force. We need to be strong and we need to box them back, or else they'll take over the world. That works if they were aggressive, but if they're not, then it's a complete misreading of the situation, and it is the first assertive step. So you need to argue that this is out of proportion with what the Soviets are up to at the time. It's followed up in March 1946 with the Iron Curtain speech. Now, this is by Winston Churchill, obviously he's not American, but he makes it in America, and he makes it in front of the American president with the American president's backing. And he says the Soviets have divided the world into, Europe into half. There's an Iron Curtain down the middle of Europe, and they are an aggressive, hostile force. Again, if you think the Cold War's already started, that's fair enough. But if you don't think it started, if you think the Soviets actually aren't being aggressive yet, this is America and their Western allies calling the first shot of the Cold War. There then follows a year where the Americans are probably not doing nothing, but where they're less active, certainly in terms of starting the Cold War, until March 1947, when by this stage Britain are exhausted and almost bankrupt, and so they start to say, look, we can't do everything that we've been doing. We need to pull out of helping Turkey and Greece. They say this to the Americans as a kind of courtesy, that we're leaving there. We can't support them anymore. The Greeks were fighting a civil war between the monarchists and the communists at the time, and so the Americans get a bit panicky, and President Truman goes to Congress and he says, I need a massive amount of money, and I need it now, and I need it to help free people of the world, especially in Turkey and Greece, to fight communism, or to fight tyranny, he said. It's very clear it's about communism. A doctrine, by the way, is like a statement of belief. So this is like his belief is that we should always help people who are fighting against tyranny, communism, and he applies that straight away to Greece and Turkey. In the summer of 1947, this is sort of extended further, really, that the help that's given. The Marshall Plan is a huge, very generous bailout by America to a bunch of countries. Now, there are two things about this. Firstly, it is super generous. In fact, there are several things about this. It is super generous. Secondly, it doesn't just get given to countries that fought in the Second World War. Suspicious. Thirdly, it does get given more it gets given to the countries that are more important in the Second World War, but some gets given to countries that didn't fight in the Second World War. Look out for them. And then thirdly, it's only given to countries that kind of agree to go along with America's demands, which in essence mean you have to open up your country to trade with them. So you have to kind of free trading capitalist economies. This means that the Soviet Union cannot take part in it, even though America pretends that they would let them in. This is called dollar imperialism by the Soviets, and it kind of is. America are trying to buy friends with their cash. This actually extends also into the Berlin blockade / airlift, which we've talked about before. And the Berlin blockade starts actually because the Americans impose or bring in, with again Britain and France, bring in a new currency to try and rebuild a sparkly new capitalist West Germany and West Berlin. And the Americans are kind of provocative and push Stalin into this action. And then finally, the Americans also get involved in the 1948 Italian elections. We often think about the Soviets rigging elections, but here's an example, not quite where the Americans rig it, but where they definitely get involved and try to influence it. The CIA, for the first time ever, gets involved in an overseas election. They provide bags of money for anti-communist candidates, and they encourage Italian immigrants in America to write letters back to their relatives in Italy. It's probably fair to say that the Catholic Church plays a bigger role than the American government in swinging the election. Maybe that people would have voted there against the communists anyway, perhaps, but the Americans certainly get involved in trying to do that. That is really well documented, by the way, in the Cold War series, the episodes of which are linked to they're on the streamer and they're linked on the History Intranet. And finally, and it's just not on the PowerPoint that sits alongside this episode that I've spoken through here, I would also add in here Truman's own election in 1948. Truman runs for election as President of America in 1948. He had become president because Roosevelt had died and Truman was vice president. Here he is trying to get elected on his own ticket. It's important for him to look like he is doing something for the country. And so if he can emphasize how bad the Soviets are and how he's standing tough against them, you need me to deal with the Soviets, then that is all good for him. The 1948 election is absolutely wafer thin. There's a very famous picture of Truman holding up a newspaper that had been printed with the wrong results because it was on such a kind of tipping point. So it's really very credible that Truman was trying to do everything he possibly could, including exaggerate the Soviet threat in order to win this election. So there you go. Those are the sort of events that historians who think America were more to blame for the Cold War tend to wheel out. Again, they tend to say more to blame, not totally to blame, but you should go and look at how that works and assess the credibility of those bits of evidence in coming to your own judgment about whether they're right. Thanks for watching. See you next time.